There are so many important elements when I think about student-driven play. The two that come to mind the most are joy and permission to be curious. Those are some really important things that keep the engine going.
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I am so excited you're here. If we haven't met before, my name is Monica Burns. I started the Easy EdTech podcast in 2019 to share my favorite tips, tricks, and strategies for technology integration. With over 200 episodes to choose from, including new ones each week, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and updates on my travels to different EdTech events. Each episode is designed to give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Don't forget to look for the link to the show notes in the description of this episode. You'll find that link right below the episode summary in every podcast app. This episode is sponsored by my AI in Education membership. Curious about artificial intelligence in education? This membership is designed for teachers and educators passionate about staying ahead of the curve. It offers a comprehensive and curated monthly experience that will keep you up to date on the latest trends in artificial intelligence and tools for the classroom. Join now by heading to my website, classtechtips.com, and tapping on the artificial intelligence button at the top of the page. This week's episode is titled How Student-Driven Play Shapes Creative Minds with Kim Zajac, who I met at an Adobe Creative Educator event in New York City earlier this summer. I knew Kim would be a great guest because of her passion for creativity, and this episode is full of actionable ideas, resources you'll want to bookmark, and plenty of inspiration. Let's dive into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Kim. I am so excited to chat with you today all about student-driven play. But before we dive in, would love for listeners to learn a little bit about your role in education. What does your day-to-day look like?
Oh, thank you, Monica. Thank you for having me on. My name is Kim Zajac, and I'm a speech and language pathologist in the Norton Public Schools in Norton, Massachusetts. And my everyday school life is a fantastic blend, partnering with educators and learners in grades 6 through 8. I support and provide services to students in learning environments ranging from inclusion to specialized programs. And the minutes of my day are spent either providing direct or indirect services and consultation. And some of that takes shape through push-in model, pull-out model, embedded service delivery. And I'm always trying to keep sort of playful engagement at the center of the work we do, because really work should feel like play, especially as, we're working with young learners. It's important that we make the process enjoyable, joy-filled, interactive, and filled with experiences. So that's sort of what my everyday world is like. And I'm really grateful to be in it.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of different experiences, even throughout a week, right, in your life as an educator. And today, as we're talking about that concept, like you mentioned, putting that play first, right, of student-driven play, can you describe the most important elements of student-driven play and how they contribute to creativity within a classroom or within a learning environment?
Sure. There are so many important elements when I think about student-driven play. The two that come to mind the most are joy and permission to be curious. Those are some really important things that keep the engine going, to keep exploring and keep trying new ways to accomplish different outcomes. I think also we need to think about those skills around communication and collaboration. Those are really essential elements through which play can be pushed further than its starting point. Honoring these sort of simple foundations can provide students with just right combination of energy and encouragement to take some risks on their own and launch them into new territory with space provided. I think sometimes we can get into the habit of leading our students in a direction And sometimes that's important and needed, but also a balance of allowing our students to lead themselves. And so I think that's important for us to think about so that these seeds of creativity can be planted and confidence can be stoked, belief in themselves, belief in each other as teammates if they're building and playing together, and, in pursuit again of new possibilities and discoveries.
I love that permission for curiosity piece, because sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm not going to ask that question, or that's not what we're doing right now. Or, there's that kind of that hesitation sometimes as adult learners, right? Of course, as students, right, in a classroom setting. So I love that you mentioned that in addition to some of these other pieces that we know we place so much value on, like collaboration and like, creativity in the classroom. So one thing, I wanted to ask you about these experiences is, how do you ensure that a playful experience, that they're inclusive and accessible to students with various experiences, with different backgrounds?
Such a great question. One we should ask ourselves at the start of any learning opportunity that we begin to embark on with our learners. I think that there's no one answer to that. I personally call on a few different tools, and I know we'll include some of these links in the resources connected to the podcast. One resource that I lean into quite a bit is called the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. And it's something that helps us to really consider a person as well as their setting, their abilities, any range of impairments they may also possess, as well as their participation and environmental and personal factors and or hindrances. So that's through the lens of a speech and language pathologist. I learned about that in my schooling. And so I try to always keep the people at the center. And in thinking through the lens of as a speech and language pathologist, I'm always looking at sort of what are the strengths, what are the challenge areas, and what are the other social impacts that could be influencing participation and an inclusive experience. So that's one resource that I call in quite a bit. But I also want to ask the students themselves for input to, for them to educate me on what's important to them and what their preferences are for making access to materials or experiences. And so another tool that I use, and you maybe are familiar with this one, it's called the Innovator's Compass. Ella Ben-Hur is the founder and the creator of this wonderful tool. And it is a framework basically of 5 questions that welcomes anyone to the table to discuss any important topic, any challenge, anything that you may be stuck in or stuck with that you're trying to sort of find new direction with. And in this case, it might be accessibility and finding more inclusive opportunities. So the compass is really nice because you can use it in so many forms. You can use it, in a discussion arena. You can use it, by adding writing onto a particular, maybe printed out compass. You can use sticky notes. You can draw. You can really use it in any way you want. And it just calls people in to talk about sort of, what's happening and why, what matters most. What are some ideas that we could explore together? And what would that look like if we were to do an experiment? And it can guide that process along when we're trying to think of how do we make this experience inclusive and accessible to all students with us.
I love that you mentioned those specific resources, and we'll link out to them, of course, for anyone who's listening today and wants to try them out themselves or, take it back to a team. Because I think sometimes when you're having these conversations with a team, right, having a framework, having a set of guiding questions can really help anchor the conversation on what is this experience going to look like? What are our goals here? And how are we really going to make sure that we address the needs of everyone who is asked to participate so that it's a welcoming experience, for them. And Kim, you and I were together earlier this summer, actually, at a Creative Educators Institute in New York City, and surrounded by educators who are thinking about creativity, sharing lots of experiences from their own environment. And I would love to hear from you, what are some successful examples of fostering creativity through play that you've observed or that you've implemented yourself?
So this is my favorite part of the work that I do with students is really getting in there and seeing what's possible. What ideas do they have in mind, and where can they take it? So I've done a lot in the last couple of years with leveraging game design and visual thinking to expand on skill development in the areas of communication, collaboration, life skills, and going through the process of that in a regulated state where teamwork and positive outcomes are possible. And so I use a variety of tools and materials and resources to do that. I really feel it's important to offer those choices. Some students on any given day may gravitate towards using their hands more. They might want to build. They may want to paint. On other occasions, they may wish to engage more digitally. They might like to explore creating something in a platform like Adobe or Canva or Google Suite, where they can visualize and create things in sort of a more digitized way. And so through both of those channels of creativity, I have worked with groups who have they've designed games themselves to share with each other. And then they've also gone on to work collaboratively as a team to create a group game through an iterative process where they, kind of come up with sketches, and they're using note cards and sticky notes to kind of map out what it will look like. And through the process, they're communicating, collaborating, and also keeping track of some of their skill development, because that's the work that I do with them, is to, build skills such as comprehension, flexible thinking, reciprocity, things of that kind. And so we use all of these tools to create a product. And so we've had some really beautiful games come out of this. We've got cardboard game pieces. We've got games that have layers to them where there's actual ladders and slides that are involved, and you have to pick them up to be able to go through the adventure. We've also had currency involved. There's, a lot of interest in money for middle schoolers. And so they've designed some really beautiful dollar bills using some of the creative applications I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so, the process is it's one that I never can predict where it will go, because it's not my, it's not me driving the learning, it's the students. So it's an adventure for us all. I'm just sort of looking to see how I can guide and provide. That's sort of my role, guide and provide in a sort of loose framework way to see them to be able to arrive at an outcome that, feels good to them and that they can reflect back on and share how was that process for them? How did it feel? What would they do differently? What would they not change at all? All of that is that's the best part of the work.
Well, I'm so glad that you talked about a product or artifact of learning for a creative product that might not be at the top of every listener's list, right? Sometimes we think about making a movie or a graphic or a podcast, all of which I love, right? But this idea of designing a game, your emphasis on the process, which is, what we're looking for in any type of creative endeavor, whether it's one of the others I mentioned, right, or the game design, right, is so huge for all of the reasons that you mentioned. And, when you were talking about this idea of almost working next to this adventure, right, that students are going on, right, guiding them through the process, I would imagine, especially for someone who might, start this out for the first time, right, that there's some challenges that go along with that. And, what are some of those challenges teachers might face when they're trying to implement these playful experiences in the classroom? And, what's some advice you might have for how they can overcome them?
I think that at first it can be really challenging to release some of the control over the process. It's just, in some, capacities, can feel a little unnatural until you've done it a few times. And then you realize how actually beautiful that is, and that it's really a gift to yourself and the learners to be able to say, we're sharing this responsibility, and the ideas are not just going to come from one direction. I think that for the educators listening, try to shift your mindset to being sort of one among the learners, while you still maintain, that you are the overseer, the educator sort of, supporting the students in their process and their student-driven experience. Shoulder to shoulder is really important. It allows you to really be there in the moment and see things literally and figuratively on level with the student learners that you're working with. And in that process, you become more comfortable, at least it's been my experience, to showcase your own vulnerabilities and ask the questions that you're, feeling apprehensive about out loud. You'd be surprised how many times a student will say, "Oh, don't worry, we've thought about that. We've got that covered." And many times they do. So I think it's important to remind yourselves that, no one expects you as the educator to know all the answers or to know the process or even the outcome, to find a comfortable space to sit shoulder to shoulder with your students, to be part of the experience with them in as many ways as possible. I think it's important to model comfort with risk taking and being okay with failure and actually celebrating it. It's really important to celebrate failure because usually from a failure grows a new idea. And that is the whole point of creativity and curiosity, is to continuously look for new and different ways of looking at, new discoveries and also experiencing perspective shifts, right? So looking at something that might be the same, but from a different angle or point of view and coming upon a realization that you didn't take note of before. But I think those are all important things to keep in your toolbox for when you might hit a little bit of a little stuck point or, a point of confusion or uncertainty. Come back to sort of those roots of, we're in this together. We're all vulnerable together, but we're also discovering beautiful things together. And in the end, when we're moving through the process, we will get to a beautiful outcome we can be proud of and call it our own, which is really super.
Just that shoulder, to shoulder aspect. I know I've had plenty of conversations having taught upper elementary school for several years with I've got it, right? Or we're on it, right? Or, I've got a vision of where we're headed next for any, all sorts of projects, right? Especially when students are working in a group where they've bounced off ideas with someone else, right? And we're kind of waiting for the okay from their teacher, to move on or to move forward. So Kim, you mentioned Adobe as one creative resource. Are there any tools or resources or methodologies that you recommend for educators who are interested in incorporating more play into their curriculum?
Yes. So one of my favorite resources is called the Critical Creativity in Action card set. And it was created through a collaborative process. At the center of that are Dan Ryder, Jackie Gardy, and Amy Burvall. Amy Burvall and Dan Ryder co-wrote a book together. It was called, I think, Critical Creativity in the Classroom. And in that book are just like oodles and oodles of amazing ideas for, kind of pushing and nudging this process that we're talking about today forward. And what stemmed from that book was the development of a card set that's available completely free to anybody. It's on, online. It's through the State Department of the English Language Learners Program. And what I love about it so much is that the cards themselves invite play to push the concepts of critical thinking forward. It encourages collaboration. It encourages collaboration, communication, higher order thinking, problem solving, perspective taking. And there's a gamified component to it because depending on how an educator might like to use the cards, you can earn points. And so sometimes there's a little bit of competition, a healthy competition, pushing learners forward to want to continue to, try a different type of card or, continue on with this particular theme because there's just a myriad of possibilities within that card deck. And so again, leaving that link in our resources that connect to this podcast will allow people to take a look for themselves firsthand. And I honestly have not met an educator who looked at these cards and have not just sort of fallen in love and said, I know exactly what I'm doing with these tomorrow. They're just really amazing.
That's perfect. Yep. And just like you said, we're going to link out to all of these things so listeners can find them. They can connect with you, of course, but also, find these resources that you've mentioned and dive in a little bit more deeply. So Kim, for a teacher, for a coach, for a school leader, who is listening today, what are some tips you have for them to put these ideas into action? Is there, one thing that they should try out? This episode will go live as, we're recording this in September. It's going to go live this month. What is something they can try out tomorrow, try out this week, maybe even just try out during the month of September?
What comes to mind is to really create a space, a mental space and a space for conversation for answering the question, what if? What if we, right? And just welcome that type of conversation from all students. Perhaps, it could be that this is something that happens during announcements or at the beginning of homeroom or at the start of first block, where there's a minute for each student to ask themselves, what if? And then fill in the blank, right? It's just an open question. And then my hope would be that some of those students maybe volunteer and share their what ifs with their teacher or their principal or, whomever, they're sharing space with at the time, even each other, to encourage that curiosity driven, creative process of thinking and ideation. Everything starts with an idea, and ideas that come to life change what we do. And so that is the way of the future. We don't know what's to come because the ideas are still waiting to come out.
And I think that's such a great prompt for building community, for gathering information, right, from students to say, what are you excited about? What are you wondering about? And just just establishing that it's a place where they're comfortable, right, to ask those big questions and that they're going to be received, really well. So this was such an actionable conversation. So many great resources and strategies for listeners to put into practice right away. So Kim, where can people connect with you? Where can they learn about your work? We're going to put all the links in, but would love for someone who's on the go to be able to make that mental bookmark of where to find you.
Sure. So I am active on social media. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Zajac SLP. I'm also active on Instagram and Threads, where my handle is at Kim Zajac SLP. You'll find on either of those landing pages that I have a link tree that will bring you to all the other facets of the work that I do, and my email as well. So I would love to hear from anybody with questions or ideas, or that might have an idea for me to try out. I'm always looking for things like that.
Well, this was so fantastic, Kim. Thank you so much for joining today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was so much fun chatting with Kim for today's episode. Now let's make this EdTech easy with a few key points from the conversation. Create space that invites curiosity. Honor the process during creative learning experiences. Ask students, what if, to establish curiosity and creativity as norms in your classroom or school. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from today's episode, including all of the ways to connect with Kim Zajac, on classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode number 233. This episode is sponsored by my AI in Education membership. Curious about artificial intelligence and education? This membership is designed for teachers and educators passionate about staying ahead of the curve. It offers a comprehensive and curated monthly experience that will keep you up to date on the latest trends in artificial intelligence and tools for the classroom. Join now by heading to my website, classtechtips.com, and tapping on the artificial intelligence button at the top of the page. Thank you for tuning in to another Tuesday episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. Stay tuned this fall for a few bonus episodes. Instead of Sundays like we've done this past year, they're going to shift to Fridays. Not every Friday, but every once in a while. So make sure you're listening on a podcast app where you can hit the follow button. That way, every new episode, not just Tuesdays, but the bonus ones too, will pop up for you as soon as they go live. And if you want to share an idea from today's episode, maybe with a friend or a colleague, You can send the link to them as a text or even tweet or post it on your favorite social media platform. You can find me there too. Just tag me at Class Tech Tips with any takeaways or questions.